Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the QT2 Systems podcast series, My Life as a Pro. Today, our featured guest is Lenny Ramsey, who is also a coach with QT2 Systems. Welcome, Lenny.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. So we were talking before, and I'm so interested in your story. So I'm really excited for you to share it with everyone. So I wanted to start out just, first, how did you get into the sport of triathlon? What brought you to it?
I should, I'll say I got into the sport on accident. I was, so kind of, I'll take a quick step back. Growing up, I was pretty athletic, played soccer for kind of at a decent level for most of my, younger years through kind of till I probably was around 14, 15. I tore ACLs in both of my knees at that point. And tried to get back into it, couldn't really, and then just did a complete like give up. So for a good stretch after that, probably 6 to 8 years, I did not do anything athletic, which was pretty abnormal just because I'd always been very active. And then so I grew up in the Netherlands, moved to the United States for graduate school after I'd done my undergraduate and master's in the Netherlands. I moved to St. Louis, Missouri to do my PhD in neurosciences there at Washington University. And when I moved there, that was kind of when I was like, okay, time for kind of a bit of a lifestyle change. And I decided to kind of pick up at least some level of sports again, at least started going to the gym, becoming more active. And that's when I finally decided to actually go see a doctor. And they recommended to get my ACL replaced and part of my meniscus removed. And I decided to go forward with that. After that surgery, I came out with a straight-legged brace because of the meniscus. So I was in a straight-legged brace, so couldn't bend it for I think 8 weeks or so. And after that, I kind of had to slowly kind of start moving again. And I started seeing a physical therapist, and he was like, "Well, what would you like to do?" And I was like, "Well, I would like to play soccer again." And he just kind of looked at me and he was like, "Well, how about we just run?" And I was like, "Okay, how about we run?" And so we worked towards that. And eventually I ran my first 5K and I was like, okay, this is actually something that I enjoy. And I worked up to a half marathon from there. And then the year after that, I ran a 5 mile race, and somewhere around mile 4, I snapped one of the bones in my foot. And little setback, had foot surgery, and they put a metal plate on it. And that's when I was like, okay, maybe I need to balance it out, not just run. And so that's when I decided to take swimming lessons. I had done some swimming as a kid in the Netherlands. Since we're surrounded by water, back in the day through school, we all took swimming lessons. So I could swim and survive, but not make any speed. So I started taking swimming lessons at the local YMCA while I was in grad school. And I got a bike from a friend of mine who had a bike that she wasn't using. And that's kind of where things started. And I met someone who had just started in triathlon as well. So he and I started training together. And that's how I kind of rolled into my first couple of Olympic distance races. And from there, I qualified for age group nationals during my first or second race. And so towards the end of that year, at some point, I then decided to race age group nationals, not knowing what I was doing. This was up in Milwaukee. I did not have a wetsuit. And I was like, I stood there and everybody was like in wetsuits. And I'm like, I don't know what's happening. But I had a great time doing it. And that's when I decided that I needed a coach to kind of help me figure all of this out. So I signed on a coach in St. Louis with Samantha Murphy with Evolve Coaching. And she kind of really got me started with, figuring out nutrition, because I'd been dropping weight over ever since I'd become more active, and especially started training. But I didn't really know how to balance that. I didn't know how to fuel myself for racing or training. And I didn't really know how to balance the three sports. And so she really kind of got me on track with that. And through that, I did my first half Ironman at the end of that year, a local half Ironman. And then the year after that, I did my first Ironman branded half Ironman and qualified for Worlds in Europe. My family is in Europe, so I figured I'd go to Austria and race it. But I then got a stress fracture probably about 2 months before that. So I did end up going because my family was there. I already had the trip planned. but that was my first run. That I ran that half marathon, but it was my first run back. I hadn't run in 8 weeks. But again, it was one of those things where I had a great time doing it. So that was year 2 of racing. And then the year after that was a bit of a mess because I was trying to finish out my PhD. So what ended up happening was that I had to hand in my PhD. This was sometime in May, I think. And then the week after that was the half Ironman in Chattanooga. So me and one of my teammates at the time, we drove out to Chattanooga. So I handed in my thesis. We drove to Chattanooga. I raced the half Ironman in Chattanooga, came over that finish line, having no idea how I did, right? Because it was a rolling start. And then my coach called me and she was like, I think you won the race. And I was like, my age group? She's like, no, I think you won the women's race. And so it turned out I won the women's race. So that's where I officially qualified for my pro card. But since I was in the middle of all kinds of stuff, there was no way I was accepting that. I was even thinking about going pro at that time. So because I had to go back and then defend my thesis the week after. And so I defended my thesis, and I had accepted a job up in Wisconsin at the time. And so I kind of was finishing up kind of work in the lab that I was working in. I defended my thesis successfully, thankfully. And then I raced, I think, Racine, and I think I won or close to won that age group race as well. And that's when I was like, okay, maybe I need to reconsider, because I didn't want to be winning races. I did this. One, I really enjoyed it, but two, I wanted to get the best out of myself. If I'm going to do this, I wanted to do it well. And I wanted to compete. And so I decided that even if I wasn't going to be, winning races as a pro, I figured at least I should try, and kind of get the best out of myself. And so that's when go ahead, sorry.
Well, I just want to back you up a little because there was a lot of information in there. I just let me put some dates tied around this. So
Right.
when did you start? So it sounds like basically you raced through your PhD program, which took 3 years.
The PhD program was a total of 6 years. I started somewhere midway.
Okay,
Yep.
you started somewhere midway. Okay, so give me, like, if you remember, give me a date when you went to the doctor, got your knee surgery done, started running. Do you remember about when that was?
I'm guessing knee surgery was somewhere. So I started my PhD program in 2010, and that was probably a year. So 2011, 2012 was probably when I had knee surgery.
Okay.
And then started running after that. 2016 is when I qualified for my pro card. And
Okay.
I had started racing or even training for triathlon 2 years before that. So that would have been 2014.
All right. So you started racing, went to age group nationals your first year that you were racing. Okay.
Yep.
And then God, that water is really cold. That's pretty amazing. You did that. It's one of my memories of Milwaukee is cold, really cold water.
I think I was so overwhelmed by all of it that I don't actually remember, but
yeah. Okay. So you got through there. Second year out, you do a Ironman branded half Ironman, you get yourself to 70.3 World Championship. So you had pretty idea early on that you had some talent here that was in there, and some athletic ability for sure. But and then you show up at a race totally harried and you win overall.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty impressive. Yeah. Okay. So so I mean, when your coach called you and said that to you, was that like, I mean, you got into a little bit. It must have been a little surprising, at least.
It was very surprising. It was very surprising. I had no idea. I had no clue that I did well to begin with, right? I knew I had a decent race. I felt like, and this is something I can get back to later. I think I've always kind of defined myself by my run because I've always known that kind of was my strongest point. And I felt like I'd had a decent run. And so I thought for me, I had done well, but the only other time I had done an Ironman branded half Ironman was the year before, right? So it had been a full year earlier when I think I did Florida, 70.3 Florida. And I placed top 3 my age group, I think, but this felt like a much bigger race to me. And I just had no idea where I was in placement.
Yeah. All right. So as you're doing all of this, I mean, usually when you talk to pro athletes, it doesn't come along with, and I was getting my PhD in neuroscience while I was doing this. So so I mean, sport at least maybe became a balance to the
Right.
academic.
I think
Or
both, I think having both gave me a sense of structure because I had to, I was that those last few months right before leading up to that half Ironman, I was really working on writing my thesis. So I spent part of my time in lab kind of finishing out projects and supervising some other students, but also part of my time I spent in a coffee shop, writing. And so I kind of balanced it, whereas I could do early morning workouts and then go straight to the coffee shop and then sit there and work for most of the day, or work in the lab most of the day, and then go home and have something else to do and look forward to, which would be, another workout. And then just call it the night, right? It just became a very structured process.
yeah, okay. So you did Chattanooga, defended your thesis, Racine, you said at the end of
I think, yeah, it was Racine. Yeah.
that year.
A couple
And
months
then,
later, yeah. And then I decided that it might be time to consider at least taking my pro card. And so I talked to my coach, and she was like, well, I don't think I have the experience needed to help you through that. And she's the one that connected me to Tim.
okay.
And kind of on accident, like I want to say maybe like a few weeks later, there was going to be the training camp at Sam Houston for pro training camp that QT2 was putting on. And Tim was like, well, why don't you just come out? And I had accepted a job up in Wisconsin, which, was as an assistant professor teaching neuroscience in a physical therapy department. And I was supposed to start that fall. And they were going to go for a 2-week camp, but that second week I would have had to start my new job. So I was like, well, I can come for 1 week. So I moved all my stuff up to Wisconsin, and then within a few days, flew to Houston to join that training camp.
Okay.
And so it was definitely throwing myself into the deep end. It was humbling, I'll have to say, but it also felt within reach. And so that's when I made the choice to kind of really start racing as a pro in 2017.
Okay. So I'm curious, when your students found out that you were a professional triathlete, what was the response? What kind of
I
feedback did you?
think, I think I had great these were great students. I absolutely loved them. There were classes of 40. We had 2 classes of 40, and I taught all of them. I taught them basic evidence-based medicine, which is kind of like research methods and learning how to read research and understand research, as well as their neuroscience. And I feel like I was like an enigma to them. I had a great relationship with them, and I loved working with them. But I think they kind of started piecing stuff together over the first couple months, right? So me, my training, my racing, and then somewhere along the way, they also figured out that I was gay, and it was all like piecemeal. These students would like kind of like very carefully ask these questions.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I think they thought it was fascinating, and I had great, it ended up being very helpful. We had a lot of discussions about things like time management, because we also had students that were still eligible because it was a 3-and-3 program. So some of them it was a D3 school, but some of them were still eligible to play sports, and some of them will put that on hold for a year. But I think, through talking about kind of how I just structured my life to make sure that it all fit in, I think for a lot of them, it was helpful to help kind of figuring out how to balance school, but also having something of life outside of it, maybe sports, maybe something else, and kind of figuring out how much free time do you actually have in a day if you actually plan it out well. And so we had a lot of discussions about that and about mindset, how do you kind of focus on improving versus, focusing on failure, which I think is something that triathlon has always told me, right? You always focus on getting better, and you might not do it right every time, and you'll have training sessions or races where it's a complete bust, but that's part of it, and you just kind of like learn from it and move forward. So we had a lot of in physical therapy programs, I think there's a lot of students that naturally enjoy sports, so I think that helped. But I also think there's a lot of good discussions that came out of it. And we ended up bringing in a bike for one of their movements classes. We ended up bringing in a bike fitter, and I would bring in my race bike, and I'm gonna be in a cycling kit and they, look at my fit and all that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of fun stuff that came out of that.
Yeah. Very interesting. So, all right. So tell me about your first pro race. What was it?
Okay. So my first race was Galveston, half Ironman in Galveston. So at this point, right, I had never done a full Ironman yet. And so Tim was my coach and he was like, we're not going to do a full unless you really, really want it. He said, you're going to be miserable either way, so you better want it. I was like, okay, let's just start with the half. I'm very new in the sport, trying to kind of figure everything out. I think the camp had helped me a lot because I had met a few of the QT2 pros, right? So I think that was helpful for me just to have some connections. But yeah, we decided, one of the season's openers usually is Galveston. And so we decided just to go for it. It's a very flat race that does not play to my strength. One, and two, I am not a swimmer. And, I didn't grow up swimming. I started taking swimming lessons when I was in, mid-20s. And then you're racing against these people that have been swimming their whole life, especially in the pro field. And so also, obviously we had to start in the front because, as a pro, that's what you do. This is all new to me. And so we start in the water and that gun goes off. And I just remember having like a heart attack, right? That gun goes off and everybody just booked it, like just took off. And I was like, oh no. So I had this moment of now what? And I was like, well, I guess I'm just on my own, going to swim from here to the end of the swim and just make it through. So that's what I did. And then the bike in Galveston, it's, if you haven't raced it, it's a straight out, straight back. I mean, there's nothing to see. There's nothing. It's windy and it's very straight and you don't really see anything. So for, 56 miles, I think I saw maybe one person. I don't know. I was maybe passed by one or two guys coming from behind, but that was kind of it. So by the time, and to me, that was mentally very stressful, right? Because it came from racing as an age grouper where either we race in waves or rolling start, doesn't really matter. I always was passing people, men, women, different age group, same age group, doesn't matter. But by the time I got out of the swim on the bike, I was passing people. And then by the time I got to the run, I was passing people. And here I just saw nobody. So by the time I got to the run, I was mentally out and I had a horrendous run. The one thing that I thought I could rely on, it wasn't there. And so I just kind of, shuffled it in. And that was my first pro race. It was, not my best experience.
So what was your discussion with Tim after that day?
I think a big part of the discussion was learning how to deal with the fact that I wouldn't be passing people. And I think, he was like, where you have to think of it as, you have a little jar. And every time when you were racing age group, every time you passed someone, it would be a penny in your jar. And he's like, now every time you pass someone, it's a quarter in your jar, or maybe even more than that. So you're going to have to, you have to reset your reference point. And we kind of transitioned from like, let's just, go into racing as a pro to let's take the season to figure out what it means to race as a pro. And so for me, it was just kind of reframing what I thought this was going to look like. I knew I wasn't going to be winning. I didn't necessarily, I don't know if I came in last that race, maybe not, but it was pretty close. I don't think I've ever looked up the results. I think at that point I was like, I just don't even want to know. It's fine. We'll just move forward. So that was a little rough of a start. But it's one of those things where, practice makes you better at it. And so you just kind of keep going. And I think I raced a bunch more that season and I don't really know kind of what all, but I think I ended up racing Boulder and doing decently there and kind of like breaking into that, top 8, top 10 for the first couple times and just feeling better about it. And it just took a second to kind of get there, to be comfortable with it and to, all of a sudden you're not going to be the best. And I think this is something that I worked with my students a lot too, because the physical therapy students that I worked with, a lot of them were direct admit students. So they already got into the physical therapy program straight from high school, but you do 3 years of undergrad first. But they were, instead of doing 4 years of undergrad and then PT school, they got into the direct admit program. So they got a 3 and 3. That means these students had always had good grades, even during undergrad, right? They kind of rolled through it. And by the time then they got into my program and I taught them things like statistics, they would come in and they would have, during a midterm or whatever, they would have their first B. And I would have them in my office crying because they had a B. And, we have to talk about how to reframe that reference point. And that in the end, that's not really what matters, right? That's not, nobody at some point is going to look back and say, well, you only placed 8th or 7th or 6th, right? Like, no, if I look back at this in 10 or 20 years, I got the opportunity to race as a pro, to race amongst some of the best in the sport, right? Did I win the races? No, but I did get to experience it. And I think it took some reframing all of that. And I'd much rather come in the back of the pack in a pro race than never having made that step and always won my age group races.
Right. Yeah. So tell me how you balance, I mean, the time, like, so when you were working there in Wisconsin as an assistant professor and your first few years as a pro, what did your schedule look like?
My schedule is a mess. And thankfully I have a very supportive wife who, we met kind of through triathlon, and she knew what the sport, she had been racing triathlon much longer than I did at the age group level, but still. So she knew what it took in terms of training. So she was very supportive around all of it. And that was very helpful. And the other thing that I'll add to that is that, for the first year, we didn't live together. She lived in Denver. And then after that, when she did move, she traveled most weeks for work during the week. So that gave me a little bit more peace where I didn't, have to worry about, spending time together. It sounds weird, but it gave both of us a little bit of space. Like she could focus on her work when she was out of town, and I could focus on work and triathlon, and just make my days long and focus on, training, work, and sleep. And there was just no space for anything else. And so, but I planned my days to a T. Like on Sunday, I would sit down and my week. The nice thing of being an assistant professor is that it does give you some flexibility. I had to be there to teach my classes. I had to be there for office hours and meetings. But if my class didn't start until 10, I didn't have to be in the office until 10. There was no reason to, right? And so as long as I had, prepared properly. So that meant that it filled up my whole week, because whatever I didn't get done during the week had to be done on the weekends. And so it was very busy. And I was always on, but it worked somehow. And but on Sunday I had planned it out, my swims, and sometimes, my early morning swims. I swim with the master's group, and I would go straight to the pool, get up at 4:30 or whatever, go straight to the pool, swim masters, drive to work, eat breakfast at work, and get things started. I think that was like Tuesday, Thursday, and then on some other days, or that was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, maybe, I don't know. And then other days I'd ride in the morning, and then plan it so that after I got home I could do the other workout. And so it just became very tight. I had my dinners planned out during the weekend so that I knew what, I didn't have to like spend time preparing dinners. My lunches were prepared on Sundays so that everything was ready. So I just made it very stacked. And I did, in the first year it was hard. I'd have workouts where my mind was with work. And then I'd be stressed about work, and my workouts would tank. And the other way around, where I'd be at work and worried that I wasn't getting a workout in. And I think at some point my wife sat me down and she's like, Lenny, you need to consider, even though you're racing as a pro athlete is a hobby, you need to consider it part of your work. So you plan it in. That means that when you're working out, nothing else it's part of your work day. And when you're at work, triathlon is not part of that. You focus on your work. And so I planned out the days basically to a T. That way I could let it go, right? So by the time I got home and I was ready to do my workout, I could let my work go. And when I was at work, I could fully focus on work and not worry about any of my workouts, because I knew that those were planned at a different time of the day. So I had to structure it very much. And I had to give myself the space to say, okay, triathlon is really important to me, and I'm giving it that space. Right. But yeah, I mean, that meant for a lot of catch up on the weekends and trying to balance things out. It was a very busy time, but it worked out.
Yeah. I mean, I say to people, I'm like, I can get a lot done when I'm really organized. Like, don't
Right.
throw something at me at the last minute. Don't do that. You know, but if you tell me in advance, I can make it work. I just need to know, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You just find a way. And it's amazing how much I mean, you don't get the downtime, but it's amazing how much you can fit in a day when you're
Right.
organized about it.
And I always tell people, like, I didn't necessarily, I had recovery weeks built in where the training load was less. And those days I was not necessarily more productive at work either. Right.
Yeah.
Because then I was like, oh, but I have more time today. So then all of a sudden, other stuff,
Yeah,
happens.
right. Very true. So tell me about like how you like put together your race schedule for the year.
Um, I think starting 2017 or so, I started racing the full Ironman distance and kind of figured out that that was where kind of my strengths lie. And I kind of planned around that. I started planning around the full distances. So kind of, not all races have a pro race. So you have to wait for the kind of the schedule to be announced. And I picked the races that I was most excited about. And I tried to kind of mix it up a little bit. And I knew that my strengths lie kind of more in the harder races. I'm better off in hillier races and hotter races than I am in flat and fast races. That's just not, you know, I just and I don't enjoy it as much. I want to have that extra challenge. And I also tried to race in Europe pretty regularly since I have family there. It was easy for me to kind of stack the two together. So I'd go see my family and race. And for a couple of years, I was able to plan 2 races in Europe and then spend like a month or so in between with my family, which was really nice. And I think that that's another thing that helps out when working in academia. I was on a 9-month schedule. So in the summer, I did do research. I was on a tenure track, which means you also have to do research and publish. And I had some summer students. But as long as I trusted my summer students, I could leave for weeks at a time. And then just come back and work closely with them and kind of balance that out, or just do virtual meetings with them. So that was very helpful for my racing. So I usually tried to plan a race, shortly after the semester ended. And then I could race about, once a month for a couple races and take a break and then maybe race another couple of times. So 4 or 5 Ironmans in a year. I could kind of move that around. Once the semester started, it's harder, right? Because depending on my teaching schedule, I couldn't just leave. I couldn't, and for Ironman, you often have to check in early. And so that became a lot harder. Half Ironmans are a little bit easier because if the race is on a Sunday, I could fly out on a Friday evening and, check in on a Saturday, and that would be fine. But that definitely took some planning. But having those like basically 3 summer months to race in, I think that's kind of where, at least in the beginning, definitely the racing was kind of focused around.
Did you ever in those early years say, okay, well, I'm doing this well and I'm working a full-time job? Did you ever say to yourself, what if I wasn't working a full-time job? Did you ever consider taking a leave of absence from your daily?
So, so I raced 2017, 2018, 2019. And then we ended up moving to Houston. So I gave up my tenure track job, partially because this wasn't my full-time gig, right? Like I was juggling the two, which was a lot. I knew it was a lot, and I was doing well at both. Could I have done better at both of them if it had been one or the other? Probably, right? Probably. But I love both. But my wife had moved up to Wisconsin for me, and while we were there, she had gone to school in Chicago, which was another thing. She was in schools in Chicago on Saturdays, so then I could do my long rides on Saturdays. So, and then Sundays was kind of our day together kind of thing. And so we were able to balance that too. But then she got a job offer in Houston, and I decided that since the move to Wisconsin was for me, and since I was trying to juggle the two things, that it was fair for her to take that job and for us to move to Houston. So we decided to pick up and move. I also have to say that I do not like the cold. So Wisconsin, lovely summers, but very long and very cold winters. There was a lot of riding on the trainer because I'm also one of those people that if it's below 60, I do not ride my bike outside. So, but we moved to Houston, and that gave me a moment to kind of figure out what it was that I wanted to do. And the problem was that I landed on that I did not want to work. My wife has a good job. She was like, you can just take a break and focus on racing. But, having, always been in school for so many years and having always worked, it was really hard for me to let that go. And I ended up taking kind of more of a part-time job in a research lab, because, in Houston, driving is also a disaster. So, also everything took longer. But and I had to actually drive out of the city for an hour to actually be able to ride anywhere. And so I decided to work, 3 days a week to give me a little bit more flexibility. And I worked in a research lab. And then a few months later, the COVID shut everything down. And so we worked from home and, was able to balance the training, but then there were no races. So I had more time to train, or at least more flexibility to do so because I didn't have to drive anywhere. But there was nowhere to race. So, that kind of, that summer was a roller coaster. And I think it was for everybody. But really building up towards races that may or may not happen, and then falling into this pit when the race didn't happen, when you feel like you're in peak shape, and then there was nothing to, go out and do. So that was rough. And we decided that Houston wasn't for us during that time. And so we ended up moving up to Wisconsin, where we are now. And there I ended up finding a job at the university, which was kind of a low pressure job. I did take a step back. I wasn't ready to jump back on being a professor, like being an assistant professor, getting back on the tenure track with a good chance that I have to start from scratch. I wasn't ready for that. And so I took a job that I knew I was overqualified for, but one that I was passionate about. I was project manager on a grant to support women in science, women faculty in science, women and women of color. So we developed programs, mentoring and leadership programs for women within kind of the more technical, so the STEM fields. And it was a lot of fun, but it also gave me flexibility to train around it. And I did that for a couple of years. Really enjoyed it, but again, I reached this point where I felt like I needed more of a mental challenge. It wasn't enough for me to have kind of a job that gave me more flexibility, even though I had a good job, or a job, and that gave me flexibility and gave me something that I was passionate about. It wasn't enough for me to not have that mental challenge of really throwing myself into something at work. Which is why last year I ended up applying for a different job. We're opening a new medical school about half an hour from here, brand new medical school, and we're building it up. So right now, I started back in June as their director of faculty affairs. And it's very much a full-time gig. So I started there. And so kind of to go back to your question, yes, I've thought about it, and I probably would have been a better athlete if I had taken the time off and spent full-time focused on training and recovery and everything around it. But that would have never been satisfying to me. I always wanted it to be a hobby. I wanted it to be fun. And I always told myself that if it wasn't, I would stop. And I've always wanted to do something on the side to keep my, brain occupied in a different way, I guess.
Maybe you wouldn't have been a better athlete because you would have had all this time and you wouldn't have had the same kind of focus, so who knows?
Right.
I mean,
and,
who
and
knows?
I think it would have added pressure, right? I think it would have added a lot of pressure because I would have felt like even though, I have a wife that has a good income, like I would have felt like I would have had to bring home money through it. And now it was always like, if I bring home money, great. If I don't, then well, so be it. That's fine too.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, when we talk about being a professional athlete, people think, oh, well, you make a lot of money. Not so much the case for triathlon, right? So how do you make money as a professional triathlete?
For me, so I made the conscious choice again to have a job and to see this as a hobby. So I never really invested in sponsorships. I got a lot of nutrition for free. I got products at a discount, but I never really focused on building my brand as a pro athlete or on really being present on social media. I have Instagram and I will post, a few times a year, but it's really not as extensive as it should be if I really wanted to bring in those sponsors. So for me, the money has always come just purely from racing. You know, in Ironman races, there's a prize pot, and the top so many will win, depending on the size of the field, the size of the prize pot. Usually it's the top 5, top 8, top 10 will win some money. And, you know, it's not huge unless you kind of, you know, go to Kona and race in the World Championships. Other than that, you know, it's a few $1,000 here, a few $1,000 there. And, you know, it's not going to make you rich. If you're lucky, it'll cover your trip. So
Right. Well, that's so how much then do you have to pay for? Do you have to pay for entry fees as a pro?
you pay $1,000 a year.
Okay.
It might have gone up a little bit, but around that amount. You pay once a year, and then you can enter any race, any pro race.
Okay. But then everything after that, your travel expenses, anything you
Right.
take.
Right. Before COVID shut things down, many places would have like a homestay program. So then local triathletes would house you. But that all kind of shut down during COVID and hasn't really properly come back up. But I had some of my best experiences with those where local triathletes housed me. For example, in St. George, there's a couple that housed me, and I've been friends with them ever since. And I've gone back there for both racing and training, and I always stay with them whenever I'm in St. George. And I love it. It's a great experience. It's a great way to meet people that are excited about the sport. It's a great way to see the local community and meet the local community. So I'm hoping that'll eventually come back, at least for the pros that are racing now. And it, again, obviously saves you costs as well because you get to stay with them. So.
Right. So tell me about you've heard about your first race being memorable in its own way, but tell me about a race for you that was like you finished it. You're like, wow, that was amazing. Do you have one of those? A few of
Yeah,
those?
so yes, I think one of my most memorable races was Ironman Lanzarote in 2019. Um, it was so living in Wisconsin. It's a race it's an early season race. I think it might be May-ish, end of May. And I had figured out that it would be like 2 weeks after the end of my semester. But you know, it's time zone differences, so I knew I'd have to go out somewhat early. And leading up to that, I trained everything except for we used to do a pro camp, a QT2 pro camp in like February-ish in Florida. But other than those 2 weeks, I had done everything on the trainer because it was very cold still. um, and but you know, I was gonna go to Lanzarote, and then I had some family that was gonna come out and watch me race, and then after that, I was gonna spend a few weeks in the Netherlands, and then I'd come back. And it was one of those things where things just seemed to kind of fall into place. I flew out. I had 10 days there. I think before the race, or at least a little over a week. And I remember unpacking my bike and putting it together. And I think it came like a day late, so that added to a little bit of stress, but whatever. I put my bike together and I got out on my bike and I went like 10 minutes out, and I remember pulling off, and I called my coach, Tim, and I'm like, I don't think I can do this because it was so windy. And yeah, I had my race wheels on the bike, and there were cars, you know, the roads are like narrow, you know, one lane each way kind of roads. So the cars would be coming right along me. And, you know, every time a car would pass, I would feel that suction and my bike would move. And I just pulled off, and I was like, I don't think I can do this. And he's like, well, it's a good thing you have another week. And I was like, okay, thank you. So, you know, it was hot. It was dry heat, but it was hot, and extremely windy, and it was very hilly, which that part I really like, and I like the heat. It's just I hadn't expected that wind. You know, race day came. It was one of the last races that still had a mass start. They started us. It was a women's race only, which shouldn't matter, but I've always really enjoyed the races that only had a women's pro race. I feel like there's more focus on the women. We're not like just kind of trailing behind the men somewhere. Um, and I feel like the races are generally, I feel like the fields are a little bigger, and I always had really good experiences with that. And but yeah, the women all lined up, and they lined up since it was kind of a mass start, they lined up on the beach. They lined up all of the amateurs about 10 feet behind us. And so that gun went off, and by the time we hit the water, there were people everywhere. But I mean, you have to fight through it. But in the end, for me, it was pretty good because normally there's a good chance that I will lose the packs of women. If I'm lucky, I can sit in the chase pack, but if a little bit of bad luck, if it's 15, 20 women, there's a good chance that I end up swimming all of the swim alone. But because everybody was together, I was able to find people that were kind of my speed and kind of just latch on, and just there was 2 laps, and it was very messy, but I feel like for me it was actually really nice to have all those people around and not just be swimming alone. The bike ride is brutal but gorgeous. I remember, normally bike ride during the full is somewhere under 5 hours. And I remember looking at my Garmin at like 5:15 or 5:20 and still not being close to being done. And I was like, oh no. But that's the course. Everybody is doing that. You just don't really know, right? Because we're all kind of spread out. And then I started the run, and it's hot, it's flat, it's along the beach. But it's 3 out and backs, which I really like. The first is like a 10K out, 10K back, and then 2 5K out and backs. And I think I did that first loop, and my family was kind of like trying to yell what placement I was in, and I was kind of running people down. And at some point, the guy with the bike pops up next to me, and he's like, "You're in 3rd place," and I was like, "I don't think so." And he's like, "I think you are," and I was like, "I don't think so." I was like, "Well, okay." But he stuck with me, and then it's a little extra mental boost, because at that point you can't stop and walk or anything, right? Because you have to finish it out. And so I think that was that race. I ended up running into 3rd, and running just under 3 hours for a marathon, which is to date still the best marathon I ever did during an Ironman. And yeah, I think the whole experience, it was just one of those things where I knew that I had it in me to run a 3-hour marathon during an Ironman. I just didn't expect it to happen then. But it just happened. That day just kind of fell into place. And so I think that day will always be very memorable for me.
Yeah, I love that. So was there a point like in your pro career where you said, yeah, I belong here, like that you really felt like you belonged in the field?
That year, so 2019, because I did that, I got injured a lot. So after that race, I ended up having a torn labrum, and being knocked out for a couple months, and kind of like wiggling my way back. And then towards the end of the season, I was able to kind of pick up my running again, and I ended up doing Ironman Chattanooga and coming in 3rd there as well. And I felt like that was a season where I felt like I was really hit my stride and felt really good. After that, when COVID hit and everything shut down, I felt like I was in top shape, but then it all kind of fell apart. And then after that, I had a few races where I just didn't find my stride, and I just felt like I couldn't get out of me during a race what I knew I had in me based on training. I felt like based on training, I was in the best shape of my life, but I just could not bring it out. And so it took me a second to kind of find that back. And I definitely doubted myself quite a bit along the way during that time. But I ended up last year racing Maryland. I think I want to say I came in 5th or something like that. But it was finally a race where I feel like the field was very competitive. So placement at some point doesn't really matter, right? You can have a 5th place finish in one race and feel really good about it, and 5th place in a different one you can feel kind of shitty about, right? But this was one of those races where I feel like the field was very competitive, and I just gave it what I had, and I feel like I left it all out there, and that felt good, and just made me feel like at least I was in the right spot.
Right. So you have recently made a decision to retire, right?
Right.
Okay, so
Right.
right. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned that I started a new job in June, and that job is full-time in the office, which I absolutely love, because I really enjoy being around people and with people. It's why I miss teaching. Right now, I'm not in a teaching role, but I work with people all day. And I am in the office from 8:30 to 5 days a week. It's a 30-minute drive. So in order to still race Maryland in September, I was going to the pool every morning. And I, get up at 5, go straight to the pool, go swim, go straight to work. And then from there, come home at like 5:30, 5:45, and then have to change and still go out. And well, here it's, June, July, August, it's summer heat, it's 100+ degrees, it's humid. I mean, it became pretty brutal. But if you really want something enough, you keep at it. And it was part of my routine. So I kept doing it. And I did enjoy it, but it was also starting to kind of, I don't want to say I was getting burnt out, but it was getting to the point where I was like, I don't think I can do all of this all the time because, normally at Friday evening, I'd finally be done. I'd sit down and be exhausted. And on Saturday, I'd get up to have to go ride 6 hours and then have to go run off of that. Right. And again, it was, 100 degrees out and it was just a lot. And even though I enjoyed it, I also realized that that was not sustainable. And to add to that, part of the reason there were multiple reasons for me taking that job. I wanted a new challenge, which I was really ready for. And two, I knew that, my wife and I had been trying to get pregnant. Sounds weird when I say it that way, but we had been trying to get my wife pregnant. And I knew that at some point, one of the three would have to give, right? Family, triathlon, and work. I knew I wouldn't be able to sustain all three at some point. And so I knew that there was kind of the end was in sight for triathlon. And so then when I found this job, which was a little earlier than I had thought I would transition jobs, but it was the right job. And I knew it was about time. And then when we found out that my wife was actually pregnant, so now we're due with a little baby boy beginning of May. I was like, okay, now it feels good, right? I feel like I needed an excuse to feel okay about leaving the pro triathlon world behind. And I think these two things gave me that. And I've always physical as an age grouper. I never wanted to end my pro career by transitioning into an age grouper. I just didn't feel like that was me. I didn't feel like that would make me happy. Maybe someday I'll get back into it, right? I'm not saying that I don't want to do triathlon ever again, but I don't want to make that transition. I also don't feel like it's fair when I feel like I still physically am in a place where I can be competitive. Plus, I don't want to race at a level where I feel like I'm not giving it my all. And so I think it was a natural time for me to be like, okay, let's take a break from this. Let's call it. And so I just, kind of abruptly, I thought maybe I'd do another race in the fall, like late fall. But after I was done in Maryland, I felt like I'd had a good race. And I was kind of like, okay, this is it. I'm good. I'm ready for it to be done. And I kind of just left it there. And then I haven't been in a pool since September. So, so there's that. Yeah, I mean, now that the weather's getting nicer, I think it'll be a little harder. But I took my bike out for the first time, not my time trial bike. I took my gravel bike out for the first time in a long time this past weekend. I had done a little bits on the trainer, but I hadn't actually been outside on the bike. And so that was really nice. But yeah, the goal is, I figured running has always been my strength. Up till, that last year, I had never just run a marathon. And I was like, well, let's focus on, so kind of cold turkey quit triathlon and signed on with a running coach. And that's kind of where I'm going to focus now. And I'm just going to try and see where that leads. And maybe it'll be great. Maybe won't be much, but I think it's a new challenge and one that I'm excited about and one that I think time-wise is a lot more manageable.
Yeah, that's compared to Ironman,
Right.
yeah, more manageable. But you weren't like, okay, no, I'm done. I'm just gonna eat my bonbons on the couch. No, I mean, you're finding a new adventure. So that's
right. I feel like I do need to do something. I feel like at this point I'm already on like Saturday morning when, I get up early because I get up early every day of the week because that's just a rhythm that is ingrained. But by the time my wife gets up, I'm like, so what are we doing today? And she's just like, oh no. Why don't you just go do something, like go for a run or go take your
go
bike out
find
or something?
something.
Yeah. So yeah, I feel like I need to do something. And I think running for me is I really enjoy running. And so I feel like that's a good alternative.
Yeah. So now looking back at it, you raced pro for, I mean, COVID involved, but what, six seasons, 7 seasons as a
Yep.
pro? Knowing what you do now, would you do it again?
Oh, 100%. I wouldn't give it up for the world.
Yeah.
It was a great experience. I loved every bit of it. Not not just the training and the racing, which to me I always really enjoyed all of that. Not every day, right? But across the board, I really enjoyed all of that. And just trying to find ways to get just a little bit more out of yourself and really trying to find those limits. I always loved that, but I also really loved the community. I loved having a supportive coach. Tim and I, we got really close over those years. He became, it's more than he knew me so well just because we talked every day about training, right? To the point where I would have a shitty day and he'd be like, I think it's time for your period. And I'd be like, oh, I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. But, and that plus the pro women's field is incredible. I met so many amazing women right through the sport, and we'd run into each other at all these different races. And I made some of my best friends over the years through triathlon, through that pro triathlon field. It's a little bit of a condensed field, but it's a very respectful field because even women that do win races, whereas I have a couple of third place finishes and a bunch of top 5 finishes, but I never won any races, right? I never made it to Kona. But even the women that did, right, they were so supportive. And it's just this great community of women that all work their ass off, and they all know from each other that we all work our asses off. And so it's even though, yes, we compete against each other, it's a very, very supportive community. Mm-hmm. And I think I've made some of my best friends through all of that. And I wouldn't give it up for the world.
Yeah. So I asked you what your students thought of you as a professional triathlete. Did the other pros, what did they think of your other hat?
I have no idea. That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, during this earlier years, when we'd go to pro camp, I would try to manage a lot of, I would record videos and stuff ahead of time. And I'd managed it with work where they said, it's fine, you can go as long as you make sure that the students have stuff to do during the 2 weeks that you're gone. And so I'd plan out like worksheets and videos and all that kind of stuff. But, we do our training sessions and I'd get back and I'd be, grading stuff or hopping on a Zoom call to like answer any questions or anything like that in between while other people were, laying out in the Normatex or in the hot tub or whatever it may be. Right. But yeah, that was always just part of my life. I don't know what other people thought of it. Probably thought I was crazy, but I mean,
I don't know. I mean, when you look at it, it's not like professional basketball, right? Some people are doing it only exclusively, but a lot of people aren't, I mean,
right,
it's maybe not to the extent that you did, but
right.
People, there's always a backstory somewhere, right? So
agreed. Yeah.
So what would you tell if you could give your younger self, go back in time, 2016, right? What piece of advice would you give yourself?
I was hoping you'd say 2000, because I'd say take swimming lessons then. Because
you can go back as early as you want.
Go back to 2016. I think the major thing I would say is don't put so much pressure on yourself, because I think I was my biggest hurdle. I was very critical and very hard on myself always. Training, racing didn't really matter, right? It was very hard for me to be content with where I was at in all aspects of life, both work and training. And it took me years to kind of learn to give myself a little bit more grace in that and give myself a little space and not fight myself so hard when things weren't perfect. Things don't always have to be perfect, I would tell myself to kind of relax a little bit. And, if you miss a single workout in a week, it's not going to break your training. I mean, I went years without missing a single workout. And it took me a while, it took me years until the past few years to sometimes give myself a little bit of extra flexibility where I'm like, it's okay, right? It's just not going to happen today. Or I just really don't have it in me today. And I mean, I would, that would end up, it used to be that I would end up, standing somewhere in the middle of a bike ride in the middle of fields somewhere, calling Tim, crying, being like, I can't do this. And he'd be like, it's okay, just go home. Right. And I'd be so frustrated. And I think the little bit of frustration never went away, but I learned to give myself a lot more grace in that and being like, okay, it's just not going to happen today. Let myself recover so that I can have a good workout tomorrow, and just be more aware of that it's okay and that everybody has those days.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I was just talking to Tim on the coach's podcast a few days ago, and he hit this concept quite a bit, like you can't, sometimes you just have to accept where you are today, right?
Right.
And not try to make something that's just not going to be. And
Right.
and when you allow yourself to step back, you're probably going to end up ahead than if you try
100%.
to push through it, right? And
Right. I fully believe that.
but that's really hard, especially when you're trying to make, something and you're like, no, I have to do this. I have to do this. But yeah, just getting that perspective, that's something that I don't know, even if someone had told you that at the beginning, if it would have changed it at all, I think that's something that you probably have to go through and learn for yourself.
Highly likely. Highly likely. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But who knows? I mean, that would be something I would tell everybody. I think, yes, you have to take it seriously, because if you're missing workouts and moving stuff around on a week to week basis, yeah, you're not going to get the best out of yourself, right? And I think that's what a lot of people on the flip side, a lot of people underestimate that too, right? I do think I got where I got because I was consistent and I nailed most of my workouts, right? And I did all pretty much the first few years. I would say I probably did all of them, right? Unless I was actually injured or sick. Um, but it's okay, on occasion to tell you to be okay with having a bad day, or to calling it halfway a workout because it's just not there and not dredging through. And I think that's, yeah, important to consider, to be realistic in what is good for your body and what is not, right? There's a fine line there.
Right. Well, this has been a real pleasure, Lenny. Thank you for taking the time. Such an interesting story. I'm so glad that I got to hear more about your journey, and congratulations on your
Thank you.
expanding family and everything. Super exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, we're very excited. Well, thank you so
Excellent.
much. This was a lot of fun.
Have a great night.
You too.